What does it take for Africans to be great? Do the people of those countries choose to be great?
How does the United States get Africa so wrong? And why are other powers like China and Russia and Turkey making more headway on the continent?
Africa is seen as a humanitarian case racked by conflict, by corruption, by terrorism, and in need of aid. All of these things are true. The problem is that they are incomplete. They present an incomplete picture of where African countries are today.
Western governments are quietly watching their influence across Africa disappear faster than they can replace it. Military partnerships that lasted decades are ending abruptly. Financial frameworks that gave Western institutions control over development funding are being bypassed. Diplomatic pressure that once shaped policy decisions is getting ignored. And regional alliances are forming without any input from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. This shift isn't happening slowly or quietly anymore. It's accelerating across the continent, and Western policymakers are struggling to figure out how to respond. The reaction from the United States and Europe operates on two distinct levels. Publicly, you hear diplomatic language carefully calibrated to avoid appearing condescending or interventionist. Officials express concern about democratic governance. They warn about the risks of partnering with countries that don't share Western values. They frame their engagement as supporting African-led solutions to African challenges. But privately, the conversations are much more direct. Western governments are losing leverage over security decisions, resource access, and diplomatic alignment. They're watching African governments make choices that contradict Western preferences, and they're discovering that the tools they've relied on for decades don't work anymore. African independence in 2026 doesn't mean every country has severed ties with the West or achieved complete economic self-sufficiency. What it means is that African governments increasingly have options they didn't have before. They can choose military partners based on what works for their security needs rather than what pleases Western donors. They can restructure debt through bilateral negotiations with China instead of accepting IMF conditions. They can reject diplomatic pressure on issues like human rights or election timelines without facing total isolation. And they can form regional blocs that coordinate positions and share resources without needing Western approval or leadership. This represents a fundamental change in how international relationships work across the continent. For decades, if you were an African government and you needed security assistance, you worked with the United States or European countries. If you needed development funding, you went through the World Bank or IMF. If you wanted international legitimacy, you sought recognition from Western governments and institutions. That model gave Western powers enormous influence. They could shape policy decisions, influence political transitions, and maintain strategic access even when relationships became tense. Now that model is breaking down. Governments don't need Western security assistance because Russia, China, Turkey, and others offer alternatives without political conditions. They don't need IMF loans because they can negotiate resource-backed financing that doesn't require privatizing state assets or cutting social spending. They don't need Western diplomatic backing because other powers recognize them regardless of how they came to power or how they govern. Western influence hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's become optional instead of necessary. And optional influence is fundamentally weaker than influence built on dependency. This matters strategically for several reasons. First, it means Western governments lose leverage over security decisions in regions they consider critical. The Sahel, for example, stretches across Africa just south of the Sahara and serves as a transit route for migration toward Europe and a region where jihadist groups operate. For years, France and the United States maintained military presence there specifically to monitor those threats. Now France has been expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The United States lost its drone base in Agadez, Niger in late 2024, after spending over $100 million building it. Without bases and partnerships in those countries, Western intelligence on jihadist movements decreases and their ability to influence regional security policy evaporates. Second, it reduces Western influence over resource access and economic relationships. Africa holds significant reserves of critical minerals needed for batteries, semiconductors, and renewable energy technology. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo produce over 70% of the world's cobalt. Zambia and DRC together account for major portions of global copper production. As energy transitions accelerate in Western countries, access to these resources becomes more important. But if African governments choose to prioritize partnerships with China or develop processing capacity domestically instead of just exporting raw materials, Western companies lose preferential access and Western governments lose economic leverage. Third, it creates concerns about precedent. If African countries demonstrate that rejecting Western conditionality doesn't lead to collapse or isolation, other regions might follow similar paths. Countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East that feel constrained by Western demands could look at what's happening in Africa and decide they have more room to maneuver than they thought. Western governments worry less about Africa itself and more about what success in Africa signals to the rest of the world about the viability of alternatives to Western-led systems. The Sahel has become the most visible example of this transformation, which is why it's worth understanding in detail. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger all experienced military coups between 2020 and 2023. These weren't ideological revolutions. They were security revolts led by officers who'd spent years fighting jihadist insurgencies while watching Western forces operate in their countries without stopping the violence. The new military governments shared a conclusion. Western security partnerships had failed to deliver security, and Western political demands around elections and governance were constraints they no longer wanted to accept. So they expelled French forces. Mali did it in August 2022. Burkina Faso followed in February 2023. Niger ended its agreement in December 2023. Then in September 2023, all three countries formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense pact coordinating their security policies. In January 2025, they formally withdrew from ECOWAS, the regional bloc that Western governments had relied on to apply pressure on coup governments. And throughout 2024 and 2025, they deepened partnerships with Russia, signing agreements that brought Russian military advisors, equipment, and the Africa Corps to operate alongside their forces. This realignment wasn't imposed from outside. It had genuine domestic support in all three countries. Anti-French sentiment in Mali and Burkina Faso is real and widespread, rooted in decades of frustration over military presence that didn't deliver results and economic relationships that many citizens viewed as exploitative. When these governments expelled French forces, crowds celebrated in the streets. When they announced partnerships with Russia, many people saw it as reclaiming sovereignty rather than replacing one external power with another. Western analysts often miss this point. They frame the shift as Russian manipulation or Chinese coercion, but that ignores the agency of African governments and populations, making calculated decisions based on their own interests and grievances. The sovereignty rhetoric these governments use resonates powerfully. They talk about controlling their own resources, making their own security decisions, and refusing to accept lectures from former colonial powers about how they should govern. That messaging works because it connects to real historical experiences and current frustrations. It doesn't matter whether Russian partnerships will ultimately deliver better security outcomes than French ones did. What matters politically is that these governments can tell their populations they're finally making independent choices rather than accepting terms dictated from Paris or Washington. Western governments have responded to these shifts in several ways, none of them particularly effective. Diplomatic pressure has been the primary tool. When Niger experienced a coup in July 2023, ECOWAS threatened military intervention with backing from France and the United States. But Mali and Burkina Faso announced they would consider intervention against Niger an act of war against them, and ECOWAS backed down. Western governments discovered that threats don't work when you're not willing to follow through, and when the targets have allies who will support them. Sanctions and aid restrictions have been another response. Western countries froze development aid to coup governments and imposed targeted sanctions on military leaders. But those measures haven't changed behavior. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger all face Western sanctions and none have reversed course. They've simply deepened ties with partners who don't impose conditions, demonstrating that sanctions only work when the target has no alternatives. Increased media and policy attention has been the third response. usually framed around security concerns or democratic governance. You see more Western media coverage of jihadist violence in the Sahel, more policy papers warning about Russian influence in Africa, more government statements expressing concern about democratic backsliding. The framing is always about helping Africa achieve stability and good governance, but the underlying concern is clearly about Western influence declining. When France lost its bases in the Sahel, French media didn't cover it primarily as a story about African sovereignty. They covered it as a story about French strategic setback and Russian gains. But here's what this shift doesn't mean, and this is important to understand clearly. It doesn't mean Africa has formed a unified anti-Western bloc. Countries across the continent are making different choices based on different circumstances. Kenya maintains strong ties with the United States and has deployed forces to Haiti as part of a UN-backed mission. Ghana continues working closely with Western partners on security and economic issues. Botswana and Namibia maintain balanced relationships. The idea that Africa is coordinating against the West as a unified entity doesn't match reality. It also doesn't mean African countries have achieved economic independence or development success. Most countries across the continent still face severe challenges. Poverty rates remain high. Infrastructure gaps are massive. Many governments rely heavily on external financing for basic services. Changing who provides that financing doesn't automatically solve underlying development problems. Partnering with China or Russia instead of the West doesn't guarantee better economic outcomes. It just means different trade-offs and different dependencies. And it definitely doesn't mean the end of Western engagement with Africa. Western countries still have significant economic relationships across the continent. Western companies still invest heavily in African markets. Western institutions still provide development assistance to countries that want it. What's ending is the assumption that Western engagement is the only game in town and that African governments have to accept whatever terms come with it. What comes next is harder to predict, but certain trends are clear. African governments will have more bargaining power than they've had in decades. When you have multiple potential partners competing for access and influence, you can negotiate better terms. Countries can play powers against each other, accepting Chinese infrastructure financing, Russian security assistance, Turkish drone sales, and Western development aid simultaneously, without committing exclusively to any single partner. That's not manipulation. That's just smart diplomacy from governments that finally have options. Competition among global powers for influence in Africa will intensify. China is already Africa's largest trading partner and biggest infrastructure investor. Russia is expanding security partnerships and resource extraction agreements. Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, and UAE are all increasing their engagement. The United States and European countries aren't withdrawing, but they're having to compete in ways they haven't had to before. That competition could benefit African countries by driving better terms and more investment, or it could create new forms of dependency and exploitation. Probably both, depending on the country and the sector. The trade-offs between sovereignty, security, and economic development will become more complex and more visible. Governments will have to make difficult choices about which partners to work with on which issues, knowing that every choice carries risks. Partnering with Russia on security might deliver short-term stability, but comes with reputational costs and potential human rights concerns. Accepting Chinese infrastructure loans provides immediate development, but creates long-term debt obligations. Maintaining Western partnerships preserves access to certain markets and technologies, but requires accepting political conditionality. What's certain is that the old model where Western preferences automatically became African policy is over. That doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean African governments will make perfect choices. It means they'll make their own choices, for their own reasons, based on their own assessments of what serves their interests. And Western governments, which spent decades assuming they would always have the leverage to shape those choices, are now discovering they don't. That's what independence actually looks like. Not perfection, not guaranteed success. Just the ability to choose, and the responsibility that comes with it.